in the Cap and Trade program. Rajinder Sahota, the Deputy Executive Officer at CARB, and Matt Botiel, Chief of the Industrial Strategies Division, who oversee the Cap and Trade program, are also with us here today, along with other members of the Cap and Trade team. This is the next workshop in a series of workshops on potential changes to the Cap and Trade program. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to program staff to present the slides.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, I am Camille Sultana, and I am an air pollution specialist within the program development section of the Cap and Trade program. And I will be giving the first part of CARB's staff presentation today. Before we begin the presentation, I will go over some logistics. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted to our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. We have 3 hours allotted. We have a great turnout with so far over 440 attendees in the workshop, and we'll work to hear from as many commenters as possible. So we ask stakeholders to keep their feedback to no longer than 3 minutes and to submit longer comments in writing. Stakeholders will be able to submit written feedback online until August 17th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents, including this presentation, on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. The objective of today's workshop is to continue the conversation on California climate policy and the Cap and Trade program. Staff will then present initial concepts for allowance budget scenarios and review the standardized regulatory impact assessment process, after which we will take public comment. Following a break, we will resume with a staff presentation on topics related to use of allocated allowance value by electrical distribution utilities and natural gas suppliers, allocation to industrial entities to protect against emissions leakage, and the voluntary renewable electricity program. We'll then open back up to public comment for the remainder of the workshop. At the highest level, California's climate policies are determined by state legislation and executive orders. These statutes and directives establish both statewide greenhouse gas targets or sector-specific goals, which inform CARB's climate change scoping plan and individual policies and regulations. This slide helps to put the state's climate goals into perspective. The line graph on the left shows annual emissions from 2000 to 2020 and California's statutory greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets for 2020, 2030, and 2045. The greenhouse gas emission inventory shows that California achieved the 2020 AB 32 target of returning to 1990 emissions levels in 2014 and has remained below the target through 2020. In 2016, the legislature called for a 40% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by 2030. And recently, in 2022, AB 1279 established 2 goals: to reduce anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2045 compared to 1990 levels, and to achieve carbon neutrality no later than 2045, meaning that for whatever emission sources exist at that point, there is an equivalent or greater amount of natural and technological carbon sinks. This ambition is evidenced within the 2022 Scoping Plan update, which identifies a need to accelerate the 2030 target to 48% below 1990 levels to be on track to meet AB 1279 goals. This increase in ambition from 40 to 48% relies heavily on CCUS, direct air capture, and the availability of renewable hydrogen. Each scoping plan is a high-level document spanning all sectors to lay out a comprehensive framework of how the pieces of the state's climate strategy, including regulations, incentives, and carbon pricing, fit together. Since the adoption of the first scoping plan in 2008, carbon pricing in the form of a cap and trade program has been part of California's successful portfolio approach to achieving the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and it will remain critical as we work toward carbon neutrality. The program is rooted in AB 32, passed in 2006. AB 32 not only set a greenhouse gas emissions target for 2020, as discussed earlier, it also authorized a market-based approach for reducing emissions. The program achieves this by establishing an economy-wide declining cap on statewide greenhouse gas emissions from industrial facilities, in-state and imported electricity generation, and transportation and building fuel use. Overall, the program covers approximately 80% of emissions in the AB 32 greenhouse gas emission inventory. CARB creates allowances equal to the cap each year, with the cap set according to California's greenhouse gas reduction goals. Each allowance is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Because the cap declines, fewer allowances are created each year, and overall emissions decrease over time. This helps establish a steadily increasing price signal, which facilitates addressing the lowest cost reductions first. Long-term, the cap and trade program provides a price signal to invest in cleaner technologies. Additionally, the cap and trade program is generally the sole funding source for the California Climate Investments Program and has provided 90% of state funding for the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program since its program initiation. California Climate Investments is a statewide initiative that invests proceeds from the sale of state-owned allowances into programs that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve public health and the environment in California. Through November 2022, over 70% of the $9 billion implemented has been directed to priority populations, including disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and low-income households. Cumulatively, CCI projects have reduced an estimated 97 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and over 80,000 tons of criteria air pollutants. From clean transportation to affordable housing and sustainable communities, waste diversion to conserving or restoring natural and working lands, and more, California Climate Investments programs reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide benefits to Californians across the state. The infographic shows just some of the many benefits California Climate Investments is providing over project lifetimes, including funding for over 400,000 zero emissions and plug-in hybrid vehicle rebates, 3.6 billion kilowatt hours of renewable electricity generation, and the planting of 200,000 urban trees. The process to update the cap and trade program is being informed by the 2022 scoping plan update, evolving state policy, an updated greenhouse gas emission inventory, and implementation experience. Each 5-year update to the scoping plan allows California to assess progress on achieving the state's climate targets and new legislation. The 2022 scoping plan incorporates executive orders, legislative direction, and board direction to lay out a technologically feasible and cost-effective path to carbon neutrality. The economy-wide modeling in the 2022 scoping plan will be used to inform review and updates of the cap and trade program, just as we used the 2017 scoping plan update for the 2018 regulatory amendments. Within each scoping plan, the cap and trade program's economy-wide carbon price has been complemented by California's suite of sector-specific regulations and incentives to support achieving the needed transformation. Review of the cap and trade program will also reflect accounting of greenhouse gases in the latest AB 32 greenhouse gas emission inventory. The inventory, published in 2022, included adjustments to align emissions from all sectors with third-party verified data. Staff will also continue to assess potential updates based on implementation needs and ongoing experience. With that backdrop, we will now begin discussion on allowance budget scenarios. The discussion will begin with an overview and history of allowance budgets. I will then explain the program's framework for evaluating 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets and present staff's initial thinking on allowance budget scenarios. Then, we wrap up by discussing the next steps in the allowance budget evaluations, including a request for alternatives to the standardized regulatory impact assessment. We will then open up for public comment on these topics until 10:30. This slide shows the Cap and Trade Program annual allowance budgets through 2030. The caps drop about 4% each year from 2020 through 2030. This plot also shows how allowances are distributed to the market. CARB distributes allowances through two primary mechanisms: direct allocation to industry and electric and natural gas utilities, shown in the yellow, dark blue, and light green bars respectively, and sale at auction to all market participants, shown in the light blue bars on the bottom. Additionally, a small percentage of the allowance budgets are placed into the price containment reserve, the dark gray bars at the top. Total allowance budgets through 2020 were established in the 2010 rulemaking and through 2030 by the 2016 rulemaking. Initial allowance budgets were determined by projected emissions for the year that a covered source category entered the program. The annual caps then declined to the 2020 cap, which is calculated as the 2008 scoping plan estimate of the 2020 cap, multiplied by the ratio of 2008 broad scope emissions utilizing MRR data over the 2008 emissions inventory estimate for broad scope sector categories. This calculation yielded an estimate that 77.5% of statewide emissions within the AB 32 target would be covered by the Cap and Trade Program in 2020. In the 2016 rulemaking, which was effective October 1st, 2017, staff relied on the existing caps through 2020, established in the 2010 rulemaking, as a starting point for developing post-2020 allowance budgets. The 2030 cap was calculated as 77.5% of the statewide 2030 SB 32 target, maintaining the same percentage of statewide emissions projected to be covered by the program as the 2020 expectation. Annual allowance budgets from 2021 to 2030 were set as a linear decline from the established 2020 cap to the 2030 cap. The 2016 rulemaking also designated 52.4 million allowances from the 2021 through 2030 caps into the Allowance Price Containment Reserve, or APCR. This movement of allowances into the APCR expectation, resulting from modeling from the 2017 scoping plan update, that covered program emissions in 2020 would be lower than the 2020 program cap. This positive news indicated the expectation that California would reduce emissions faster than required under AB 32. The number of allowances moved into the APCR was calculated as a difference between 2021 through 2030 annual caps and the lower cumulative emissions set by a path that started from the 2020 covered emissions modeled in the 2017 scoping plan, declining linearly to the 2030 cap. Designation of allowances into the APCR did not alter the total annual allowance budgets for 2021 through 2030. Additional allowances from annual budgets through 2030 have also been designated for cost containment purposes. In the 2010 rulemaking, 122 million allowances from the 2013 through 2020 allowance budgets were designated for price containment. In the 2018 rulemaking, 23 million allowances from the 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets were designated to the APCR to account for changes to offset usage limits. Additionally, 37 million vintage 2016 and 2017 allowances that were unsold at auction for more than 24 months were designated to the price ceiling by the self-ratcheting mechanism that removes allowances from auction supply during periods of low demand. A total of 156 million allowances are currently in the APCR, and 78 million are in the price ceiling account. CARB staff are now evaluating a range of allowance budget scenarios for 2021 through 2030. The process and methods employed by CARB staff in the current evaluations are informed by and built upon cap setting and budget evaluation work in the 2010, 2016, and 2018 rulemakings. This slide will illustrate the general framework for the specific allowance budget scenarios introduced later in this presentation. The chart at left illustrates the trajectory of 2021 through 2030 annual budgets as specified in Table 6.2 of the current regulation. CARB staff are evaluating hypothetical adjusted annual budgets for 2021 through 2030, shown in orange bars, that are supportive of state climate policy. Each hypothetical scenario declines linearly from 2021 through 2030, with the reduction from current annual budgets shown in the hashed bars. Each hypothetical scenario yields a cumulative reduction dependent on the total difference from the current annual budgets. To practically achieve the cumulative reduction derived from any hypothetical scenario, potential adjusted budgets would only alter future annual budgets for years 2025 through 2030 in Table 6.2 of the regulation. This framework enables a total 2021 through 2030 total allowance budget supportive of state climate policy, while adjusting 2025 through 2030 annual budgets. CARB staff are exploring hypothetical linear decline scenarios with a 2021 start point and 2030 endpoints informed by the 2022 scoping plan update, an updated greenhouse gas emission inventory, and state climate policy. Each hypothetical scenario for 2021 through 2030 determines the cumulative reduction achieved by potential adjusted annual budgets for 2025 through 2030. Specifically, CARB staff are currently exploring one 2021 starting point and three 2030 endpoints, resulting in a total of 3 hypothetical scenarios. For all scenarios, the cap and trade program is calculated to cover 77% of AB 32 greenhouse gas emission sources for 2021 through 2030, based on recent covered emissions, greenhouse gas inventory data, and 2022 scoping plan modeling. This slide presents the 3 2030 endpoints utilized in the hypothetical allowance budget scenarios relative to the current 2030 allowance budget. The 40% by 2030 scenario is consistent with the existing 2030 target in statute, reducing emissions by 40% from 1990 levels, and will evaluate the impact of reflecting recent adjustments made to the AB 32 greenhouse gas emission inventory. The 48% by 2030 scenario is informed by the increased ambition that the 2022 scoping plan modeling indicates is needed to be consistent with achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. In the 2022 scoping plan, achievement of the 48% target relies upon mechanical carbon dioxide removal and availability of renewable hydrogen in the second half of this decade. The 55% by 2030 scenario will help illustrate an upper bound on ambition for 2030. CARB staff are evaluating a 2021 start point for the allowance budget scenarios described as the adjusted inventory scenario. The adjusted inventory scenario reflects impacts of updates to the greenhouse gas emission inventory on the 2017 scoping plan reference scenario. In the adjusted inventory scenario, the 2021 start point would be derived from an adjusted 2017 scoping plan reference scenario, as described in the following slide. This method is similar to the approach used to originally establish 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets, but reflects recent updates to the greenhouse gas emission inventory. As previously discussed, the 2017 scoping plan's reference scenario estimate of 2020 emissions was used already in the 2016 rulemaking to designate approximately 52 million allowances from 2021 through 2030 budgets to the APCR. The figure at right shows the 2017 scoping plan reference scenario in the dashed line, and the solid black line is the 2017 edition of the greenhouse gas emission inventory, which informed the scoping plan modeling at that time. The 2022 edition of the greenhouse gas emission inventory, shown in the red line, included adjustments to align the inventory with third-party verified emissions data for covered sectors. Emissions in the 2022 edition of the inventory are on average lower than the 2017 edition of the inventory by 13.7 million metric tons for data years 2012 through 2015, the last 4 data years in the 2017 edition of the inventory. The gray dashed line shows the 2017 scoping plan reference scenario, also adjusted downwards by 13.7 million metric tons, reflecting updates to the greenhouse gas emission inventory made in 2022. The adjusted 2017 scoping plan reference scenario provides an estimate of 2020 emissions, an anchor that is different from the original 2017 scoping plan reference scenario. This approach to estimating 2020 emissions is consistent with the previous approach the program has applied for establishing allowance budgets, and avoids using actual 2020 emissions from the greenhouse gas emission inventory, which are an outlier due to the pandemic. The 2021 starting point is determined by applying a linear decrease from the adjusted value of 2020 emissions to the 2030 target. This approach reflects the projection of 2020 emissions that could have been used to establish the 2021 through 2030 annual budgets during the 2016 rulemaking, had the greenhouse gas emission inventory at the time reflected recent data and method updates. This slide shows the estimated cumulative number of allowances removed from the current budget for 2021 through to 2030 for each of the 3 endpoints in 2030, 40, 48, and 55% below 1990 levels. Each case uses the same starting point in 2020 that was described in the previous slide. This slide shows potential 2021 through 2030 allowance budget trajectories derived from the 3 hypothetical scenarios. For each potential budget, the cumulative reduction from each corresponding hypothetical scenario is achieved by adjusting 2025 through 2030 annual budgets, and the decline path is set at a constant annual percent change from 2024 through 2030. Again, we are not merely talking about keeping the existing caps and moving allowances, but resetting the caps in the regulation for 2025 through 2030. As CARB further develops allowance budget scenarios, staff will consider whether to reevaluate allowance budgets using a method consistent with the 2010 and 2016 rulemakings, as proposed in the adjusted inventory scenario, or potential other methods that are reasonable and based on sound data, including reflecting the impacts of the pandemic. For the 2030 target, staff will also continue to assess whether the 2030 target should be aligned with existing statutory targets, with the increased ambition supportive of the 2045 carbon neutrality pathway as described in the 2022 scoping plan, or with an upper ambition of a 55% reduction from 1990 emissions. CARB staff will also consider uncertainty around SB 905 implementation and renewable hydrogen growth in achieving reductions modeled by this 2022 scoping plan scenario. Staff will also consider the potential impact of the 5% bank on budget modeling and total compliance instrument supply through 2030 and post-2030. CARB staff continues to support the need for hedging in the market to protect against price spikes. This slide illustrates the total 2013 through 2030 Quebec and California allowance budgets distributed in current account holdings. Approximately 62% of allowances from the 2013 through 2030 budget have been retired or are held in private accounts, while approximately 2.3 billion allowances are currently in jurisdiction accounts. From the total 2013 through 2030 joint allowance budget, this slide shows the source of California allowances that CARB staff is considering for retirement to achieve budget reductions. This includes allowances in the price ceiling and APCR accounts and vintage 2025 through 2030 allowances currently held in jurisdiction accounts for future distribution at auction or by free allocation. At this time, staff is evaluating which pools should be utilized for allowance removals. The goal of a potential budget adjustment is to increase stringency, which requires the program to consider removal from allowances that would go to auction or allocation in addition to the other pools. The slides presented today represent initial CARB staff work in evaluating allowance budget scenarios. Next steps in this process include building out allowance budgets for 2031 through 2045, evaluating the removal of allowances from different available pools, and evaluating total compliance instrument supply informed by state climate goals and 2022 scoping plan modeling. Allowance price evaluations will then be independently modeled by both Quebec and California teams for the various budget scenarios. The allowance budget scenarios and corresponding allowance cost evaluations will also be used to develop the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA. The SRIA is a statutorily required analysis that considers the economic impact of proposed major regulations. It will provide analyses of the cost, benefits, and macroeconomic impacts of the proposed regulation, which may not represent the final staff proposal, and 2 additional regulatory alternatives. The SRIA is submitted to and reviewed by the Department of Finance. CARB welcomes public input on alternatives to the initial modeled scenarios as discussed in this workshop. In particular, CARB encourages public input on alternative approaches that may yield the same or greater benefits than those associated with the proposed regulation, or may achieve the goals at lower cost, and are consistent with requirements in statute. Any submissions should discuss the alternative's ability to fulfill the purposes of the initial modeled scenarios as CARB has presented them. Include the associated cost-benefit information and data sources to enable comparison of economic impacts, and include a clear description of the basis for any cost calculations. Over time, there have been questions raised about the impact of the program and local air pollution, the 5% banked allowances, and the forestry protocol. CARB has done evaluations of all of these and posted materials on its website to ensure accurate and data-driven information is available to the public. We'll now move into feedback on the allowance budget scenario topics. We will also have a second feedback session after the allowance allocation topics presented later this morning. As a reminder, if you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raised hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button and proceed to introduce yourself and provide your comment. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until August 17th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. As a reminder, we are limiting comments today to 3 minutes to accommodate as many people as we can. We also have a timer on the top right of the slide so that you will know how much time is remaining. With that, I will now pass things to my colleague, Cypress Figueroa, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thank you, Camille, and good morning, everyone. We will now begin our public comment session. Our first commenter is Charlotte Nesbitt. Charlotte, please unmute yourself and you may begin to speak. Charlotte, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
No problem, go ahead.
Oh, I have no.
Oh, you have no comment. Okay, no problem. Thank you. Okay, next we will move to Brian McDonald. Brian, please unmute yourself and begin.
Yeah, hey, good morning. I have a couple of questions. I'm just trying to understand some of the data that's being shared. So slide 14, we talked about the historical forecasting of projected emissions at 77.5%. In slide 19, it moves to 77.5%. Just trying to understand where that 0.5% is going and why that change wasn't quite clear to me. And then I guess, is that 0.5% equal to this 13.7 million metric tons that's shown in slide 22? Hope that's clear, my question. Just trying to follow the math a little bit.
Hi, Brian. So the original scoping plan and initial rulemaking estimated that by 2020, 77.5% of total AB 32 emissions would be covered by the program. So that estimate was made during the 2010 rulemaking for 2020 and then continued in the 2016 rulemaking and projected out to 2030. Recent data from the greenhouse gas inventory are covered emissions, and also the scoping plan 2022 modeling indicates that now, as starting in 2020 and for the most recent data years, so this is an average of 2018 through 2020, we find that the covered emissions make up 77% of total AB 32 greenhouse gas of the greenhouse gas inventory. So actually that modeling that was done early on really actually got very close, which is remarkable. And so for all of the scenarios that we're working with now, we are using this most recent data that shows the expectation that covered emissions make up and will continue to make up through 2030, 77% of the AB 32 total greenhouse gas inventory. That 70%, 77% number is different, is unrelated to the adjustment that was made in the 2022 version of the greenhouse gas inventory. The 2022 version of the greenhouse gas emission inventory used verified data and sources and methods, and showed that the total AB 32 greenhouse gas inventory for recent data years was about 13.7, if I remember correctly, million metric tons higher than the 2017 edition of the greenhouse gas emission inventory. And so that adjustment is actually to the entire value of the AB 32 inventory, and they're not necessarily related. Sorry, the recent 2022 greenhouse gas emission inventory shows that the emissions are 13.7 million metric tons lower than previously estimated relative to the 2017 greenhouse gas emission inventory. So I hope that clarifies your questions. I think I got to all of them.
So Camille, I can jump in here.
Yeah.
The other way to think about it, Brian, is that we have most of the covered emissions regulated through cap and trade and other sources, other regulations and incentive programs, but you also have the short-lived climate sources out there, landfills, dairies, and other types of emissions that are not covered, like refrigerants in the cap and trade program. And those in our scoping plan modeling showed would continue to grow over the next 2 decades. And so they are going to take up a larger share of that overall total inventory, while the covered cap and trade emission sources continue to decline because of the variety of programs that cover them.
Thank you, Camille and Rajinder. Next, we will hear from Caitlin Rodner. Caitlin, please unmute yourself and begin.
Thanks, Cypress. This is Caitlin Rodner-Sutter with Environmental Defense Fund, and this will be very quick, and we will submit written comments, but I just wanted to say that we really appreciate CARB holding this workshop. We support the efforts to increase the climate ambition of this really important program, specifically through tightening the emissions cap. The cap is the most important part of the cap and trade program, so pleased to see CARB taking this on. And generally, we're interested to see the cap calibrated to achieve at least the 48% reductions as outlined in the scoping plan, and would also be interested in seeing any cap adjustment reflect the volume of banked allowances, as well as capturing some of the emission reductions that were achieved during the pandemic. From our perspective, maximizing the near-term emission reductions to reduce cumulative climate pollution is essential to addressing climate change. So we're really glad to see CARB's focus here, and look forward to digging in further on some of the additional considerations that you've all raised today. So just a thank you for doing this.
So I'm going to make an observation about that, because I think it's important to recognize the 48% relied heavily on new technologies and fuels, such as carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture. The other thing is that we needed to have renewable hydrogen at 426 times current volumes available by 2030. There's a slide in here that talks about uncertainty around both of those. And I think if we're going to have a serious conversation about the 48%, we need to make sure that those additional tools are available in this time frame to be accessible for the covered entities to actually be able to hit those targets and be in compliance with the program. In terms of all the different adjustments that were just laid out by Caitlin, again, I'm going to emphasize that those can be looked at in isolation, and they all sound great in isolation, or they sound like they're reasonable things to do in isolation. But we want to look at the cumulative impact of all of those on the program. And if we ratchet all of those levers and all of those features of the program, we could have unintended consequences, like really high prices that shoot up into the APCR and price ceiling as soon as those amendments go into place or are put out as proposed amendments. And so while we appreciate those comments, I think we, as the administrator of the program, need to think about how they interact with each other and what that means for some of the other statutes, such as cost-effective and technologically feasible. And also consider impacts to ratepayers, and as we did in the scoping plan, consider impacts to some of the low-income households and how to make sure that they are protected against some of those, and we don't see a bigger gap in opportunity and wealth happen because of this program and just changing all these features all at once. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. Next, we will hear from Eric Mincer. Eric, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hi, this is Eric Mincer from Gelber Group. Thanks for taking my question. I just have a question about the 2030 endpoints and the numbers. Like for the 40% scenario, it says 199 million metric tons. For 48% reduction, it says 173 million metric tons. I just want to know, are those numbers reductions from the 2017 edition of the 2020 reference? or are they based on the new 2022 edition? I guess from my calculations, it looks like it's still using the 2017 one. So I just want clarity on that. Thank you.
Hi, those reductions are relative to the 1990 level of emissions. So when we talk about 40% reduction, 48% or 55%, they're all relative to our 1990 emissions levels. And that is how AB 32 and SB 32 have always referred to achieving emissions reductions relative to that baseline.
Thank you, Camille. Next, we will hear from Andre Templeman. Andre, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So a couple of quick questions and touching on some of the stuff that Rajinder just brought up. I guess one question is if the anticipated or hoped for technological developments in CCS and hydrogen do not occur along the timeline by 2030, could you see an adjustment to the caps initially and then a readjustment at a future scoping plan back upwards if the technologies were not available as expected or as hoped for? I mean, question number one. Question number two, in regards to your comment about prices going up to the APCR, I know you'd in the last call suggested that the APCR levels might be moved up, so that is that to allow for the price to move up without triggering the APCR? Because I guess one of the questions I would have is if you remove tonnage from the program via these adjustments, but then just release new tonnage through the APCR levels being breached, are you effectively having the same emissions but just a higher price level? And if that's the case, you know, is that being done just for the price level? And then the last question, I guess, is in terms of the three scenarios laid out, the 40%, the 48%, and the 55%, is the 48% sort of a based on the scoping plan and based on the discussions that have been had so far, essentially the default, or is the 40% still potentially on the table as one of the scenarios if CARB determines that the 48 or 55 is too aggressive? Those are my questions. Thank you.
So I can take those. I mean, obviously, one of the things we want to do is set the caps that send that long-term signal, and adjusting them every few years is not really a helpful way to run a long-term transition program. So the goal is to figure out a way to set the caps this time that map up with whatever ambition level we choose for 2030. So on that last question, all of those options are on the table. We will do modeling, and we will understand through that modeling what the cost impacts are, and then have a staff proposal. But as we think about the program right now and the caps that we want to do as part of this amendment process, we're concerned about the long-term signal and making sure that it's reasonable based on the most readily available data that we have today on implementation, including statutes, including costs. We have built in tools such as the APCR and the adjusting floor to make sure prices continue to go steadily upwards, to have that long-term price signal for innovation and deployment of clean technology and clean energy. But we want to make sure that we are not just doing something that increases prices for the sake of increasing prices. We want to make sure that we're putting in the right amendments, the right signal to actually send the policy statement that we want to see reductions. It's not about the money, it's about the reductions. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. Next, we will hear from Pete Marsh. Pete, please unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Pete Marsh here from Long Beach, California. I'm a military academy graduate, veteran of 25 years active duty military service, followed by a decade in private industry at the regional director level. I'm now in my third career as a solar contractor and a microgrid developer, and I'm active with several climate solutions NGOs in addition to that, including co-lead of a national electrification action team. I'm speaking for myself today. I really appreciate and respect the thoughtful responses to public comments in real time by knowledgeable program leaders. That is not easy. It's exceedingly rare and is commendable. So thank you. Also really appreciate the analysis in depth that you've undertaken here and are undertaking. But I encourage you to even further slash the supply of credits, which has historically made them too inexpensive to be as significant a driver of emission reduction as they should be. I would ask you to target at least the 55% reduction. And this is in line with essentially the climate and energy leaders globally regard the 60 plus cap and trade programs at the national and supranational and subnational levels around the world as, for the most part, except in a handful of the Scandinavian countries, have regarded as having caps that are too high to result in the high prices that really would affect industry actions. If we do this, we know that industry will complain bitterly, as I can attest firsthand from boardroom meetings. But then industry will do what it does, adapt and overcome, leveraging the private sector's ballyhooed ability to be nimble and responsive. Don't let the cries of woe is me deter you from what we need to do. Design the caps to increase prices from I think they're currently in the teens or maybe a little up from that. They should be well over $100 now and climbing year by year. So thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to comment, and let's do this.
Thanks, Mr. Marsh. By the way, the credit prices right now are about $35 a ton, and I think they hit all-time highs in the last few weeks. I would encourage you in your new career to work with local agencies and local permitting groups to ensure that we can actually implement change on the ground, because just setting something in statute or setting it in a regulation or in a plan isn't really going to realize those emission reductions in the real world. And the barriers that we see across almost all the sectors are actually building out the new energy and technology infrastructure to help us hit those targets. And we've had over 200 years of building our way into this fossil economy, and we're asking to build our way out in 25. So would encourage you to think about what more can be done to make sure that projects can be cited to bring on new energy such as solar and wind, given that there's a report out about all of the local ordinances, state level ordinances that prohibit some of that large scale energy development, how to site hydrogen plants, and how to get waste diversion out of our landfills. So would very much welcome your support and help on actually helping get some of these projects on the ground in the near term so we can be successful at hitting any target that we choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. We have 3 hands raised. We will now hear from David Jenkins. David, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So my name is David Jenkins. I'm an energy trader based out of London. Based on the materials that have been sent over the last day or so, we've got 3 sort of questions based on the new information. My first one is regarding the 5% bank, i.e. the current overhang of allowances. Are CARB considering an emission containment reserve like the market stability reserve seen in the EU emissions trading scheme, or any other sort of more dynamic mechanisms to reduce allowances? My second question is related to the current scheme ending in 2030. How much does this series of workshops and the eventual rulemaking address the extension of the scheme, for example, to 2045? I know we've talked about longer term goals, but it was only mentioned once or twice in 2 bullets in this latest materials. My third question is that CARB seems to be leading the way on the workshops and regime updates, but this is a linked climate scheme. Quebec Ministry obviously say they are working with CARB on this, but they have their own climate goals. So to what extent is any new rulemaking going to be aligned with the Quebec climate goals? And will or when will this be taken into account? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So on the 5% bank, which is actually a good story because that means those emissions didn't happen but could have happened. Those will be part of the overall modeling analysis that we do. There was a slide here that talked about us looking at allowance budgets in California and taking into account the 5% bank. We absolutely believe that some hedging is important in any of these programs, especially as we think about tighter caps and as we think about more stringent overall jurisdictional targets. And so I want to make sure that everyone knows we're not trying to eliminate what's in the bank, where we do think a bank is important to these types of programs. We already have automatically ratcheting mechanisms in the program. Any additional features such as an ECR, what's being done in the EU ETS, would have to be considered after we've completed our cost modeling, both here in California and in Quebec. On the post-2030 piece, we are looking at what the program would look like post-2030 out to 1245 because AB 1279 is on the books right now. And because we want to make sure that if there's going to be additional discussion and the legislature wants to weigh in on a post-2030 program, we have the data to help inform that discussion. Our chair has already had public comment that we do believe we have the authority, but we know that on a program this expansive and based on experience, the legislature will be very interested in weighing in on what it looks like post-2030. And the work here is going to help inform that if they choose to pick that up. In terms of Quebec, we had our first workshop jointly with them. They have different targets for their jurisdiction than we do. There's going to be key things that need to be aligned in terms of the market mechanics across the regulations. But ultimately, what we need to make sure on our side and on their side is that whatever target we choose for the jurisdiction, whether it's 40, 48, or 55, and if they say at 37.5 for 2030, that all of that is reflected, those budgets are reflected correctly in the modeling that we're going to do across California and Quebec. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. We will now hear from Michael Wera. Michael, please unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. And I'll just start by saying I'm so appreciative of ARB's efforts on this and efforts to be transparent about where the market stands and the relationship to the 2030 and 2045 goals. I guess as a potential commenter, I have a few questions about how to think about doing economic analysis. I recognize that there is uncertainty about the program post 2030, but given the size of the privately held allowance pool, I think unless we have some clarity from ARB about what they'd like to see in terms of economic analysis, it's very difficult to conduct any kind of cost effectiveness evaluation. So I'd like to hear from you whether you want to hear about both an extension of cap and trade past 2030 and an end to the program in 2030 in terms of achievement of targets and cost effectiveness evaluation. And then related to that, providing the kind of feedback that ARB is asking for by August 17th is challenging, given that you're asking for economic impact assessment of potential changes to market structure. And so, and I guess our desire would be that if we do provide comment to make it as useful and compatible with ARB's consideration of scenarios as possible. I'm wondering if ARB is going to make available anything, any modeling tools that they plan to use in their economic evaluation of costs, particularly allowance cost, so that others could take those tools and use them to evaluate the compatibility of potential policy changes. Thank you very much. And I'll just say again how appreciative I am of staff efforts on this critical policy, and also the many others that I know work hard on every day. Thanks.
So just to pick up on some of those questions, we are not working on any in-house tools, and so we will not be making anything available. We are going to be using some of the work that's been done previously at the UCs to look at allowance supply and costs, and looking to them to help build some of that out. Additionally, Quebec has some in-house tools with one of their departments that they will be using, and it's unclear to me if they will make those public or not, but certainly we can send this request along. In terms of the scenarios, we had on the last workshop, we did say that we were going to look at both a program that ends in 2030 and one that goes beyond 2030. And so that was clearly articulated in across 6 scenarios that we looked at in the first workshop. I would direct you back to those. In terms of assumptions or anything that we use in our modeling, we will put that out once we have any preliminary results to share. Because this is a market program, we will not be behind the scenes coordinating with any stakeholders on assumptions or tools that they may have to look at the types of things we're looking at. We take our responsibility very seriously in terms of being the administrator of these market programs. We know that there are secondary markets. And so I want to make sure that you all understand that you may ask for some of this in-depth conversation with us behind the scenes, and we will most likely be declining that because we do take seriously our role in the market that we have, this one and the other market program that we have. So thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. We will now hear from Alexander Bernstein. Alexander, please unmute yourself and begin.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for taking the time to really explain this to us in depth, and for holding these workshops. I really appreciate it. And I also respect, the comments that you made about, being wary of sending the right price signals. And so I had a question, would the risk to ratepayers be reduced if the money collected from these allowances was used to directly offset the increased cost burden of consumers, and particularly low-income communities? Has such a solution been considered, and what is CARB's position? Thank you.
So currently, I think you're aware that the utilities get allowances that are consigned at auction and then returned twice a year as a climate credit to residents. And the utilities also have programs for low-income households. Any additional changes to the use of consignment value or trying to get additional money into low-income households from the climate credit needs to be carefully discussed with our partner at the PUC. And so that is why staff in the next presentation for today will tee up some of these questions to bring those, in the forefront of people's minds to weigh in the comment period. But a lot of that has to be coordinated across state agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. Looks like we only have one commenter remaining. Clayton Munnings, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello, this is Clayton Munnings with the International Emissions Trading Association. Just wanted to note that we agree with the presentation that the program will remain critical as we move toward carbon neutrality. To that end, we also applaud CARB next step of building out allowance budgets through 2045, as indicated in the presentation. This long-term certainty is critical to not only market performance, but also in-state investments and emissions-reducing technologies. The timing of this is particularly important given the passage and implementation of the IRA federally. We also commend the notion of changing future allowances rather than touching the existing bank. A healthy bank is a crucial part of any program and often indicates success in achieving early emissions reductions. I also want to add with a note that I think it's key that we remember the cap and trade program is a system with many levers. So in the example of SB 905, if SB 905 does not produce the emissions reductions that we hope it does, then of course the cap and trade program would likely pick up those emissions reductions and allowance prices would increase. That probably is a good thing, unless of course, as an earlier speaker indicates, the prices rise too fast and hit the APCR, releasing additional allowances. So from an environmental perspective, that would be a bad thing that we should probably strive to avoid. So therefore, we really need to think about the whole system. So how does, for example, SB 905 interact with other design options within the cap and trade system? And one that comes to mind for myself and for AIDA is whether carbon removals will be accounted for under the cap and trade program and perhaps incentivized by the cap and trade program. By way of this example, I'm trying to illustrate that I think it would be helpful to have a bit more elaboration on kind of what design levers are in play so that we can understand how all the pieces of the system within the cap and trade program work and interact with pre-existing policies like Senate Bill 905. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I'll just note that since the very beginning, the cap and trade regulation has had a provision in there that if there ever is an approved carbon capture protocol or methodology adopted by the board, that would reduce your compliance obligation. And so even as we sit here today and we're thinking about implementation of 905, and then also about the intersection with cap and trade, first we need to have 905 in place. We need to make sure that all of those pieces, pipeline safety, are addressed. The seismicity issue is addressed by our partners over at the Geological Service. And then also make sure that we recognize whatever methodology or regulations come out of 905 back into the cap and trade program to have the ability to net out from your compliance obligation anything that's sequestered. So I think, yes, it's important to understand that, but we have a few steps to do on 905 before we get there.
Thank you, Rajinder. We will now hear from Jan Warren. Jan, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Good morning, Jan Warren from Walnut Creek, and I don't have the technical handles that most of the questions are this morning, but I appreciate the opportunity to learn from everyone. I have a comment on one of the first slides that weren't gone over, that the cap and trade program is critical funding for equity and solely funds the AB 617. And the slide says there's 23 billion provided and 9 billion implemented. So I'm not, the underlying amounts I don't understand. And I know that when I live in the Bay Area, so I know that when we first started getting AB 617 funds, they were like in the millions, and that was statewide. And so we have the original AB 617 neighborhoods, and there are others that are continuing to be added. And so that needs to have adequate funding as we go forward. And so I don't understand how much has been actually supplied to the AB 617 programs for the air districts, separate from EV, and the housing and the other pieces that you're talking about. And in terms of all these credits that are going to utilities and industry and so forth, I don't totally understand that piece. And if there's a website or something I could go to get the details, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for your question. So Matt Botil, Division Chief of ISD, and I will say that to the last point, yes, there's a website where all of this information is clearly documented. So that's if you just go into like a Google search and say California climate investments, you will find the website that identifies the breakdowns of funding. So to your other questions about the dollar amounts, as the money comes through from cap and trade auctions, as the proceeds come through, the legislature and the governor through the annual budget process appropriate funding to various different programs for use in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for the AB 617 program. And so each year as those budget appropriations are made, the amounts of money appropriated to those programs go up or change. And the 24-ish billion or so dollar amounts reflect the total money that's been generated through the cap and trade auction proceeds to date. And the 9 billion represents the money that has flowed through that legislative process, through budget appropriations to specific programs. And then those programs have actually put that money into individual projects. That process can take a little bit of time because the budget process is about a year, and then the state agencies, after they've been appropriated money, they need to go then develop grant program guidelines and go and distribute that money to projects. So both of those numbers, the 24 billion and the 9 billion, they grow over time as these agencies implement more projects. And the website that I mentioned earlier, that has the breakdown of how much money has gone to the various different programs, including the 617 program. I just don't have that dollar amount off the top of my head.
Thank you, Matt. We will now hear from Robert Archer. Robert, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Thank you. There's been no discussion of carbon offsets. Could you please give an update on the current CARB view on carbon offsets, and what do you see going forward through 2030? Thank you.
Sure, I can take that one. So we do have a compliance offset program that is part of the cap and trade program. There is still an offset usage limit of 4%, which moves to 6% later in this decade per AB 398. And so we will continue to implement the direction in AB 398 for the compliance offset program. Thanks, Cypress.
Okay, and it looks like we have no more hands, so I'm going to pass it back over to Camille Sultana.
Thank you, Cypress. So I think we are going to now take a break. It is currently 10:10. And I think we will take a break until 10:20, waiting for a little bit of confirmation for that right now. Yes, okay, yes. So currently it is 10:10. We will break for 10 minutes until 10:20, and then we will start the next staff presentation at that time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. We are now going to transition into talking about allowance allocation topics, and I'm going to hand it off to Staff Air Pollution Specialist, David Allgood. Dave?
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Allgood, and I will be presenting the second half of today's workshop on potential updates to the cap and trade program that will focus on topics related to allowance allocation. We will first review allocation to electrical distribution utilities, or EDUs, and natural gas suppliers, or NGS, for ratepayer protection. We will then discuss opportunities to use of allocated allowance value and consignment requirements to support our state's climate policy. I will also present a number of topics related to industrial allocation for the protection against emissions leakage, including the following: allocation related to electricity purchases, new product allocation, allocation for biofuels production, and benchmarks for the oil and gas production. Next slide, please. CARB allocates free allowances to electrical distribution utilities and natural gas suppliers for the protection of ratepayers from the cost burden of the program. A portion of these allowances are consigned to auction, with the proceeds from the sale at auction going to the consigning utility. Each utility that consigns allowances to auction must use the proceeds for the benefit of its own ratepayers. A majority of allowance value allocated to utilities is returned to ratepayers in the form of California climate credits. These credits are non-volumetric, meaning they're not tied to the amount of electricity or natural gas consumed, and each of a utility's eligible ratepayers receive the same credit amount. California climate credits are an essential tool to protect ratepayers while maintaining the carbon price signal and preserving the appropriate incentives for energy conservation and fuel switching. Next slide. This chart shows how all EDUs and NGS, including all publicly owned utilities, have used allocated allowance value during the 2013 to 2021 years. Per the regulation, allocated allowance value, including any allocated allowance auction proceeds, must be used for the primary benefit of retail ratepayers of each utility and consistent with the goals of AB 32. Through 2021, over $9.8 billion of auction proceeds from allocated allowances were used or designated to greenhouse gas reduction projects or returned directly to electric and natural gas ratepayers, with over $7.4 billion of non-volumetric return to residential ratepayers and $0.9 billion provided to industry and small businesses. Next slide. The chart on the left shows how $1.5 billion of EDU and NGS allocated allowance value has been used for ratepayer greenhouse gas reduction projects through 2021. These are per expenditure reports submitted to CARB annually from the utilities. Funded greenhouse gas reduction projects include energy efficiency, renewable energy, building and transportation electrification projects, among others. Next slide. Highlighted by the gray bar on the right of the chart, using allocated allowances for program compliance is allowed in limited circumstances. Investor-owned IOUs must consign all allowances to auction and use the proceeds for ratepayer benefit, as directed by the California Public Utility Commission, or also known as the CPUC. Publicly owned utilities and electrical cooperatives are currently allowed to choose to consign allocated allowances to auction or to use them for compliance. Many publicly owned electrical utilities choose to consign their allowances to auction, their allocated allowances to auction, or spend the proceeds on greenhouse gas reduction activities, such as renewable electricity purchases. Both natural gas suppliers, both investor-owned and publicly owned, must consign a minimum percentage of their allocated allowances to auction, as specified in Table 9-6 of the regulation. In 2023, the minimum consignment percentage is 65%, and it increases 5% a year until reaching 100% in 2030. Allowance allocation to utilities plus consignment preserves the carbon price on electricity and natural gas rates to incentivize energy efficiency and enables a mechanism to protect ratepayers from increasing prices. Next slide. All utilities must use allocated allowance value as specified in the cap and trade regulation. Uses of publicly owned utilities or POUs and cooperative auction proceeds are determined by their governing bodies in conformance with the requirements of the cap and trade regulation. In addition to meeting the regulation requirements, investor-owned utilities or IOUs also comply with statutory and CPUC directives for auction proceeds. SB 1018 directs up to 15% of annual electricity IOU auction proceeds to various clean energy programs, including multiple programs for expanding access to rooftop and community solar in disadvantaged communities. SB 1477 directs $200 million of natural gas IOU auction proceeds to the Build Program and Tech Initiative, which provide incentives for building electrification and especially electric heat pump installation. The CPUC also directs $120 million of natural gas IOU auction proceeds for biomethane biomethane pipeline interconnection activities, biogas gasification pilot projects, and additional heat pump water heater incentives. After IOU auction proceeds have been set aside for these specific programs, the remainder is distributed non-volumetrically as climate credits to ratepayers. Natural gas IOUs distribute a California climate credit solely to residential ratepayers, with electricity IOUs providing a credit to residential ratepayers, qualified small businesses, and emissions-intensive trade-exposed EITE industrial ratepayers for emissions leakage protection. Next slide. In the context of California's decarbonization strategy, utility allocated allowance value is a critical tool to both protect ratepayers from cap and trade costs and to support the transition from natural gas to clean electricity use in homes and businesses. The 2022 scoping plan update scenario for 2045 carbon neutrality depends upon a significant decrease in natural gas use in buildings, which is largely replaced by increased use of clean electricity. The cost impacts of the gas system transition may disproportionately burden low-income ratepayers who lack the financial means to readily purchase and install efficient electric appliances for their homes and businesses. Meanwhile, high retail electricity rates pose further concerns for ratepayers who are able to electrify. Staff is exploring how requirements for non-volumetric returns could be updated to help alleviate this cost burden. And we will be discussing these potential changes with our partners at the CPUC. Next slide. In support of this goal, staff is requesting input on the following questions. How can EDU and NGS allocation be used to maximize ratepayer benefit and support scoping plan targets? How could the requirements for the use of allocated allowance value be designed to better protect low-income ratepayers and priority communities? Should the requirements for the use of allocated allowance value differ between electricity and natural gas utilities or between IOUs, POUs, and co-ops? Next slide. As noted earlier, electricity POUs aren't required to consign any allowances, and they have local control over how to use their allocated allowances. In the graph to the right, you can see that since the program inception, 63% of the total allowance value allocated to POUs and co-ops has been deposited for compliance. The remaining allocated allowance value has been used to purchase allowances, which was prohibited since 2017, or it's been used for renewable energy purchases and projects, energy efficiency projects, and other uses consistent with the regulation. Currently, POUs and co-ops choose to consign most of their allowances to auction. Unlike POUs and co-ops, electricity IOUs are required to consign all allowances to auction per SB 1018. Next slide. Monetization of allowances through consignment at auction supports transparency and that this value will be used on behalf of electricity ratepayers. Consignment of allowances that are freely allocated to an EDU ensures that carbon costs are reflected in all electricity prices and helps support competition in the electricity markets. IOU EDUs are required to consign all allowances to auction. Independent and IOU-owned generators are expected to pass through the carbon costs when participating in CAL-ISO electricity markets. Early in the program, very few generators owned by POUs co-ops participated in the CAL-ISO market. However, today, the majority of POU and co-ops are participating in the CAL-ISO energy imbalance market. Staff is considering consignment requirements in light of these shifts in participation to ensure that the regulation supports reflecting appropriate carbon costs by all generators in the wholesale electricity markets. Requiring consignment by publicly owned EDUs would better align the use of allowance value amongst investor-owned EDUs, publicly owned EDUs, electrical cooperatives, and natural gas suppliers. Transparency derives not so much from the consignment process, but from requiring reporting by IOUs to CPUC and to CARB on how auction proceeds are used. For example, publicly owned NGS are required to consign allowances to auction, and the annual reporting to CARB describes how these proceeds were used to benefit its ratepayers. Next slide. CARB staff requests feedback addressing the following questions. Should the regulation require POUs and co-ops to consign allowances? If so, should all entities have the same requirements? Should consignment requirements depend on the size of the entity or other factors? And what should be the basis for any different requirements? Next slide. Now I'll be moving on to industrial allocation topics. First, I'll begin by talking about emissions leakage. Pursuant to AB 32, CARB designed the cap and trade program to minimize the potential for emissions leakage. Emissions leakage is a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in state with a corresponding increase in out-of-state greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions leakage can occur when compliance costs faced by regulated businesses are not shared by their competitors outside the regulated jurisdiction. On the right, you can see an example where we have in-state industrial facilities facing competition from out-of-state facilities. If in-state businesses were to fully pass through compliance costs to consumers, consumers may shift purchasing to unregulated out-of-state goods. This could lead to a decrease in emissions in production in-state, but lead to an increase in out-of-state production and emissions. CARB addresses leakage risk primarily through direct allocation to covered industrial entities. CARB's allocation framework is designed to reward investment in energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions reductions while maintaining production within California. Next slide. Most of the allowances allocated to industry is calculated using the product-based allocation methodology shown in this slide. This method is CARB's preferred approach because it preserves incentives for efficient in-state production. Over 98% of industrial allocation is calculated by the product-based method. For each eligible product, annual facility allowance allocation is dependent on the facility output of a specific product, as reported and verified under our mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation. And this value is scaled by the assistance factor, benchmark, and the cap adjustment factors, as shown in this equation on the slide. Assistance factors reflect leakage risk from industrial sectors and are listed in our regulation. Assistance factors were originally conceived to be in the range of 30 to 100%, depending on the leakage risk. But in the passing of AB 398 in 2017, the legislature prioritized industrial leakage protection and set all assistance factors to 100% for all sectors. The cap adjustment factor declines each year in proportion to the overall annual allowance caps. Applying the cap adjustment factor ensures that in future years, sufficient allowances remain available for other purchases, such as auctioning, and that all sectors face increasing incentives to reduce emissions. And finally, allocation is scaled by the product benchmark. Benchmarks represent direct on-site greenhouse gas emissions per unit of specific product, and they do not reflect emissions associated with purchased electricity. Benchmarks for each product are listed in our regulation under Table 9-1. Next slide. To protect industrial customers from emissions leakage risks from electricity purchases, the CPUC directs IOUs to rebate eligible industrial facilities that are emissions intensive and trade exposed, EITE. Eligible facilities include both industrial covered facilities under the Cap and Trade program, and smaller industrial non-covered facilities. Currently, CPUC staff calculates the credits for covered EITE facilities using calculations that closely mirror CARB's industrial allocation calculations, including by using complementary benchmarks and the same product output assistance factors and cap adjustment factors. CARB's industrial allocation methods do not account for carbon price embedded in purchased electricity. CARB staff annually support CPUC in this process by identifying the facilities that are covered in the Cap and Trade program and by securely providing facility output to CPUC. Currently, covered industrial facilities in POU service territories do not necessarily receive the same type of leakage protection as facilities in IOU service territory. Next slide. Staff is considering directly allocating to industrial covered entities to mitigate the leakage risks associated with carbon costs in purchased electricity. CPUC has requested that CARB directly allocate allowances to covered industrial facilities to mitigate leakage risk associated with carbon costs in purchased electricity, instead of the existing process of crediting through IOUs with CPUC oversight. Having CARB provide such allowance allocation to industrial covered facilities will ensure that covered industrial customers of POUs are provided the same leakage protection as IOU customers. The 2016 regulatory amendments reduced post-2020 allowance allocation to each EDU by the amount the utility would credit to covered industrial facilities, with the intent to directly allocate these allowances to industrial covered facilities. Adding this industrial allocation for electricity purchases is needed to complete this planned transition. Next slide. Staff is evaluating completing this transfer of responsibility for providing leakage protection to covered industrial facilities for carbon costs in electricity purchases. We're thinking about transferring this from CPUC to CARB. This transition would not change the level of leakage protection or the value provided to covered industrial facilities. Staff is requesting comments from stakeholders on whether this transition should continue. Staff is also seeking comment on if covered industrial customers of POUs and co-ops face leakage risks associated with carbon costs in electricity purchases that are similar to IOU customers, and if they should receive similar leakage protection. Next slide. Now moving on to new product allocation. To receive product-based allocation, an industrial facility must produce an eligible product listed in Table 9-1 of the Cap and Trade regulation. If a facility currently receiving product-based allocation begins producing a new product not listed in Table 9-1, that facility will not receive allocation for that unlisted product. A regulatory amendment is required to add any new products to Table 9-1, and this can take multiple years to gather sufficient data to support this change. In the interim period, that facility is potentially exposed to leakage risk for unlisted products. Similarly, if a facility may modify a product, for example, due to a market shift, such that it falls outside the regulatory definition of a product, that is, such that it falls outside of a regulatory definition of a product that is eligible for allocation. A mechanism would be needed to incorporate into the regulation to be able to address leakage risk during the time from when a facility begins producing a new product and when that product is added to the regulation. Next slide. So CARB requests feedback from stakeholders on whether this type of allocation is necessary to address such temporary periods of leakage risk, and if new products are added to the regulation, Should CARB also provide allocation for prior years corresponding to the start of production? Next slide. CARB staff is considering updating or adding product definitions and benchmarks in a number of sectors, including the following: biogenic fuel production, cement, chemical production, milk processing, mining, oil and gas, and snack foods. Today, we will discuss two of these potential product benchmark updates, and those are biogenic fuel production and oil and gas, the oil and gas sector. We'll be discussing these two in more detail. Moving on to the next slide. The 2022 scoping plan lays out a path to decrease petroleum fuel demand by 94% by 2045, and a shift to biogenic fuels to meet ongoing demand for legacy on-road, aviation, and off-road combustion engines. The 2022 scoping plan is aligned with the Zero Emission Vehicle Executive Order, which calls for refineries to transition away from producing petroleum fuels. This transition within California is currently happening, and a few in-state petroleum refineries have or are currently making modifications to manufacture biogenic transportation fuels. CARB staff is considering how the program can integrate the direction of this ZEV executive order and the scoping plan update, including evaluating allowance allocation for transportation fuel production from biogenic feedstocks. Petroleum refineries receive product-based allocation for activities listed in 9-1 of the Cap and Trade Regulation. Petroleum refineries specifically receive allocation for the activity of petroleum refining using the complexity weighted barrel as the output metric. However, there are no benchmark or activity for biogenic fuel production in Table 9-1. Under the regulation, a facility allocation can be calculated either by the product-based methodology or the energy-based methodology, but not both. Biogenic fuel production facilities are anticipated to engage in other Table 9-1 activities with allocation calculated by the product-based method and will therefore not be eligible to receive any energy-based allocation. CARB staff is seeking input on the application of the product-based allocation method for the production of drop-in biogenic transportation fuels. CARB staff requests feedback addressing the following topics: what activity or activities and outputs should be used to provide product-based allocation for biogenic refining activities? From what data sources and years should applicable benchmarks be generated? CARB staff asks stakeholders to consider the following in their feedback: the Cap and Trade Program One Product, One Benchmark framework, a consistent approach for facilities solely producing biogenic feedstocks and facilities producing both biogenic and petroleum feedstocks, and the data availability for benchmarking purchases and rulemaking timelines. Next slide. This slide gives a brief background on California's oil and gas sector. In 2022, California oil fields supplied over 130 million barrels to California petroleum refineries. Current CEC data indicates that crude oil extraction with California is steadily decreasing. At the same time, a UC Santa Barbara analysis indicates that the greenhouse gas intensity of crude extraction in California is increasing. In 2021, California produced crude refined in California had a carbon intensity of 16.8 grams of CO2 per megajoule, while the carbon intensity of crude oil imported into California had a lower carbon intensity of 11.4 grams of CO2 per megajoule, which includes emissions associated with crude oil extraction and transportation. The UC Santa Barbara study concluded a key reason for the high emissions intensity of California crude was the use of thermal enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, utilizing fossil gas combustion for steam production. Next slide. Thermal EOR means the process of using injected steam to increase the recovery of crude oil. Non-thermal production is defined as all other extraction methods other than thermal EOR. The California Cap and Trade Program provides product-based allowance allocation for oil and gas extraction using two benchmarks that are differentiated by production methods. Crude oil extracted by thermal EOR is allocated for production using a thermal EOR benchmark of 0.0811 allowances per barrel of oil equivalent. Crude oil extracted using non-thermal methods is allocated for production using a non-thermal benchmark, which is approximately an order of magnitude lower at 0.0076 allowances per barrel of oil equivalent. Due to these method differentiated product benchmarks, in-state thermal EOR production faces a lower relative carbon cost per barrel relative to non-thermal production. Through budget year 2023, the Cap and Trade Program has provided approximately 80 million allowances for oil and gas extraction, with the majority of these allowances for thermally enhanced oil recovery. CARB requests feedback on alternative approaches for the oil and gas production. CARB asks that stakeholders and the public should consider in their feedback the one product, one benchmark framework, ability to appropriately incentivize the lowest greenhouse gas method of production, alignment with state climate policy and the 2022 scoping plan update, and emissions leakage risk considerations. Next slide, and this will be our last topic on voluntary renewable electricity. Under the Cap and Trade Program, voluntary purchases of renewable electricity can only ensure greenhouse gas emissions reductions if these purchases are tied to the retirement of allowances budgeted for the program. The Voluntary Renewable Electricity, the VRE program, allows purchasers of eligible voluntary renewable electricity to request retirement of allowances on their behalf. The VRE program supports purchases of renewable electricity and RECs that are not mandated by another program, such as the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and provides a mechanism for the recognition of voluntary purchases of renewable electricity in our program. CARB retires allowances each year for eligible voluntary renewable electricity generated in the previous year. Next slide. The regulation specifies a small percentage of vintage 2013 to 2020 allowances be set aside in the VRE reserve for the VRE program. It places 0.5% of the annual allowance budgets for budget years in the first compliance period, which is 2013 to 2014, and 0.25% from budget years in the second and third compliance periods, 2015 to 2020, into the VRE reserve from which allowances may be retired. As shown in the figure to the right, over 7 million vintage 2013 to 2020 allowances were set aside, and almost 1.9 million allowances remain for calendar year 2022 and beyond. However, once the VRE reserve is depleted, entities will no longer be able to recognize voluntary renewable electricity purchases using the VRE program. CARB requests feedback addressing the next slide, please. CARB requests feedback addressing the following topics. Should the VRE reserve be replenished? From what budget years should the VRE reserve be populated? And what number of allowances should be designated to the VRE reserve? And that concludes my presentation. Moving back to Rachel and Camille. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave. We will now move into the second feedback portion of the workshop. As a reminder, if you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button and proceed to introduce yourself and provide your comment. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until August 17th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. As a reminder, again, we are limiting comments today to 3 minutes to accommodate as many people as we can and encourage all longer comments to be submitted online. We also have a timer on the top right of the slide so that you know how much time is remaining. With that, I will pass things back to my colleague Cypress, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thank you so much, David and Camille. We'll first hear from Brian McDonald. Brian, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thank you again. My question is around slide 55 and 56. The considerations for the changes to the benchmarking process, you state it's one product, one benchmark framework. Biogenic fuel production facilities may contain, both processing equipment as well as on-purpose hydrogen gas production. So are you suggesting that, facilities that may contain both of those types of process units be held under one benchmark framework, different than, say, how a petroleum refinery is handled today, where you have the CWB plus the hydrogen gas production? Just point of clarification there.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for that question. Here we were pointing out that for each specific product, our framework is generally one product, one benchmark. Under the current regulation, I think as you're aware, hydrogen is a separate product, and we're not indicating that there would be a change to that.
Thank you, Rachel. Next, we will hear from Brian Beering. Brian, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, this is Brian Beering with Ellison Schneider. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. My question was in relation to the emissions leakage discussion and the possible updates to some of the emission leakage categories. I remember at the last workshop, CARB discussed a pretty comprehensive study that was going to be taking place. It sounded like over the course of the rest of this year into next year. And I was just curious if that was going to be completed in time to inform some of the updates to the benchmarks.
So Brian, I can take that one. We had the timing for that additional work and that study, and it may come in after we've completed this rulemaking and have to be integrated in at a later point. But that is something we will absolutely be considering as staff is working on a proposal for this regulatory amendment package. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. We'll now hear from Travis McCuitt. Travis, please unmute yourself and begin.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, everybody, for having this presentation. So it's Travis with HMH Energy Resources. So I just have two questions. Hopefully they're not too off topic here, but there's been discussion so far about some of the framework, and I know some of that already exists for extending this program beyond 2030. I know there's no answer to that, but my first question is there any sort of a timeline or any information on when that decision might be made, just for planning purposes for the folks out there that are participating? So that was question number one. And number two, on the allocation side, does CARB foresee any changes to the university public service allocation? We have sort of a factor going on through 2030, but I know that could change. And I'm wondering if there any information on that particular topic. So those are my questions. Thank you.
So I can begin there on the question about 2030 and timing. Last time when we looked at a post-2020 program, that discussion happened in 2016 and 17. But because we're here and we've just completed a scoping plan, we are doing the technical work to look at the program design post-2030. Obviously, that we still have time to think about what kind of direction or conversations the legislature would like to have. And so we're going to continue to engage on that front, but there's no requirement or deadline set anywhere that we have to finish any post-2030 discussion in a specific time frame or a specific timeline. But I think it's important as we think about the federal dollars that are sitting out there and the long-term transition that we're trying to do, to have in place frameworks for the long-term policy signals as soon as possible to help inform those long-term planning discussions and to help people think about how to leverage some of the federal incentive dollars and tax credits sooner than later. I'm going to pass it to Rachel on the second question.
Yes, thanks, Rajinder. Thanks, Travis, for your second question as well. If you have thoughts or suggestions about university or public service facility allocation, and if any changes should be made, please submit those in your written comments. We'd be interested to get your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from John Constantino. John, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Great. John Constantino on behalf of the Southern California Public Power Authority. Question related to POU consignment. Heard a little bit of transparency as a reason, but this issue actually came up 5 years ago, and there was a robust discussion related to the impacts associated with having consignment, full consignment or required consignment for POUs. So question is, other than transparency, has something else policy-wise changed? Why the revisiting of something that was discussed in great detail once before? And then second question related to the industrial electricity issue for POUs. Would that impact their table 9-4 allocations? And I guess third question is when or if will table 9-4 utility allocations be discussed? Thank you.
Hey, John, thanks for those comments and questions. Regarding the consignment question, yes, there has been robust discussion about this issue in the past. We are taking a look at this again, as we stated on the slides. Both for transparency reasons and because there has been a notable shift in POUs and co-ops participating in our electricity markets that has happened over the last 5 years. And also we're reconsidering that element of the program in light of potential higher stringency to meet our 2030 48% targets. And I think your other question was related to whether the topics related to how to use auction proceeds would impact Table 9-4 allocation to EDUs. The topics we are discussing and focused on today are really around the use of allocated allowance value and not specific to Table 9-4. We welcome your comments on those changes as well if you would like to provide us with your thoughts and suggestions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Next, we will hear from Todd Jones. Todd, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Todd Jones. I'm with Center for Resource Solutions. We have two comments today. Our first comment is regarding the VREP. We are asking CARB to reinstate allowance allocations to the VREP. As you presented today, there are now less than 2 million allowances remaining in the VRE reserve account. That's following retirement of nearly 1.8 million for 2020 VRE sales and nearly 1.1 million allowances for 2021 VRE sales. We expect similar volumes for 2022 and 2023, in which case the VRE reserve account will be depleted this year or next year. And as you said, depletion of the VREP would mean that voluntary purchases of renewable electricity will not affect statewide emissions and will be subsidizing compliance for emitters, which could affect voluntary demand for renewable electricity in California. And importantly, there are some VRE programs that are required by the state and that are required to either be Greenie certified, which requires use of the VREP, or directly required to use the VREP. It's not clear what those programs will do if the allowances are depleted. We've previously submitted comments with proposals to improve the set aside, and regarding your specific questions about allowance allocations, we'll submit those in writing. Our second comment is regarding a REC reporting requirement for specified source imports. I wasn't sure where this fit with the presentations today, but in 2017, CARB removed a requirement in the regulation that if RECs were created for electricity generated and reported pursuant to the MRR, that the REC serial numbers must be reported and verified. We recommend that this requirement be reinstated, consistent with California's definition of a REC and how RECs are used in other California programs. Other jurisdictions and voluntary programs use RECs to track the direct emissions from renewable generation to state load. In the view of some of those regulators and program administrators, reporting the emissions associated with renewable imports under California cap and trade critically affects the eligibility of those RECs. A requirement in the cap and trade rule for REC reporting associated with electricity imports and data sharing with Regis and other states will give those other states and CARB the information needed to allow those states to make their own decisions about RECs and their programs. Thank you so much.
Todd, thank you for those comments and questions. Maybe I'll start with your REC comments first. Just as a reminder, CARB's program is focused on reporting of emissions and tracking of emissions, and RECs are not equivalent to allowances and do not have that role in our program. Those are very different metrics and used for different programs. And so wanted to make that clear. If you have on the VRE program, please submit any additional information that you think we should know about or consider as we think about the VRE reserve and the program going forward in written comments. We would appreciate that. So thank you, and pass it back to Cypress.
Thank you, Rachel. Looks like we only have a small number of hands raised. If you have a comment, please do raise your hand for an opportunity to speak. We will now hear from Bang Feng. Bang, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, Bang Feng with Los Angeles Power and Water Power. My question is regarding the POU consignment. So you said it's to ensure it's because of the CAISO participation. Can you kind of elaborate on how that is an issue? Because the freely allocated allowances are kind of prohibited from being used for sales into CAISO?
Hi, Bing. Thank you for your question. The regulation currently and has for since its inception prohibited the use of using allocated allowances for non-ratepayers, and so that is related, as you noted, to not using allocated allowances to support compliance for electricity not used for your ratepayers. Here, we're looking at the public utility and co-op participation in CAISO markets of utility-owned generators and ensuring that our consignment requirements support carbon pricing of those generators in the CAISO market. So that's the issue that we've been thinking about, and we welcome your feedback and comments on those evolving changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Next, we'll hear from Nicholas Gee. Nicholas, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, this is Nicholas Ge from Musket Corporation. I'd just like a little more clarification on what exactly falls under drop-in biogenic fuels, and also if the idea is to provide allocations to only sources that are switching from petroleum to renewables, or is this also going to be for new and existing biogenic fuels production?
So on that piece, we're going to continue to work with our stakeholders to understand what the potential opportunities exist for those biogenic fuels, the new ones that are being considered out there. So we don't have an exhaustive list at this time, but we are continuing to take feedback and engage with stakeholders that are thinking about transitioning those refineries as to what the potential feedstocks could be. So if there's any ideas that anyone has out there that we should be considering, please submit those in written comment form. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Clayton Munnings. Clayton, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, this is Clayton Munnings with the International Emissions Trading Association. I just wanted to applaud the focus on protecting against emissions leakage and preserving local jobs. Fully protecting against emissions leakage and fully preserving local jobs is critical to the success of the cap and trade program. I did want to point out, though, that the cap and trade program operates within a suite of command and control policies and subsidies, as we heard at the outset of this presentation. And I want to draw attention to that command and control policies also have positive emissions leakage rates. And I think that those leakage rates can often be higher than for the cap and trade program. So this might be out of the context of this work stream, but I wanted to ask whether CARB has looked at emissions leakage rates associated with non-cap and trade policies and how those compare to cap and trade leakage rates, realizing again that might be outside of this work stream. Thanks.
Yeah, Clayton, that's a really good question. Obviously, many of the sectors in the state are covered by the cap and trade program, so we've looked at many of the sectors. In terms of other specific rules and regulations, the language for minimizing leakage exists in AB 32. And so as other programs do cost effectiveness and they look at technical feasibility, there is sometimes an implicit and then sometimes an explicit discussion about leakage in those programs. For example, on 1383, we looked at dairies and achievement of the 1383 targets, and in that's mostly an incentive program to date. As part of that discussion, with a report posted about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, there was a discussion on leakage. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. We will now hear from Susie Berlin. Susie, please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Hi, good morning. Susie Berlin for NCPA and GSPC. I had a question on the allowance consignment for the publicly owned utilities. And one of the comments that was made was that the transparency derives not from the consignment process, but from the reporting. And the POUs also report on the use of their allowance value. That wasn't mentioned in the presentation. Is there a shortcoming in that reporting that you're looking to address?
Hi, Susie. Thanks for that question. What we were highlighting in that comment, you're correct that POUs and co-ops currently report on uses of allocated allowance value. However, there is greater transparency on how allowance value is used when it's in the form of proceeds. We can see how those monies are being expended for ratepayer benefit in greater detail and with greater focus. So that was the distinction that we were highlighting today. And I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Rachel. It looks like we have one hand raised currently. So Catherine Larson. Catherine, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, good morning. This is Catherine Larson with SMUD. I had two clarifying questions on slides 42 and 43 related to EDU consignment. On slide 42, I was trying to understand the statements on the second and third bullets that POUs and co-ops are currently consigning most allowances, but also that 63% of the, that one, 63% of the allowance value has been deposited for compliance. Can you just clarify how those relate, that a majority of allowance value has been deposited, but most are also consigned?
Hi, Catherine. Happy to clarify that. So this slide shows total like buckets over time from 2013 through 2021. And over time, the majority of that value has been used for compliance costs, but in more recent compliance periods, the majority of POUs and co-ops are consigning their allocated allowances. And I don't know if you had another question, so perhaps we can unmute Catherine again.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And then my other question was on slide 43, and just clarifying the last bullet. I think oh, maybe it wasn't on slide 43. It was on the slide for EDU and natural gas supplier allocated allowance value supporting state climate policy. And one of the bullets was requiring coordination with the CPUC. And I just didn't understand what, wanted to better understand the idea of coordination for the CPUC coordination.
So this is Rajinder. I can take that one. Obviously, if we're looking at sectors that are regulated by the CPUC and we're proposing any kind of changes to these parts of the regulation, we will want to discuss with them and understand their perspective on anything that the staff would ultimately propose. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. Next, we will hear from Jan Warren. Jan, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to ask another question. I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly because things are going fairly quickly. On the biogenics, did I understand it correctly that you could only use either a one benefit, the low carbon fuel standard or the cap and trade, that you couldn't use both? The other question is, for crude that is purchased out of state, how is the extraction determined to be either thermal or other? And finally, you're deep diving on these two particular areas. Will the other 6 areas be addressed in further workshops? I'm curious about the snack one. Thank you.
Hi, Jen, I can take those. So to date, both the LCFS program and cap and trade programs cover transportation fuel supplier emissions, and they cover any in-state oil and gas extraction and refining emissions. There's one difference. The LCFS also picks up life cycle emissions for anything that's extracted and refined outside of the state of California, which the cap and trade program does not. So there's two different accounting systems across these two programs. If you are taking action to reduce your emissions and it happens in state, then both LCFS and cap and trade will recognize those reductions. We don't give you an opportunity to pick one or the other. We recognize it in both. And that's recognized in both for that action, but in our inventory, it's only recognized one for tracking progress towards our targets. In terms of out-of-state thermal and non-thermal, that gets picked up again in the LCFS program, which is looking at life cycle emissions, which can be beyond our borders. But for cap and trade, we try and stay within our borders because our accounting framework for cap and trade is consistent with the way that we do our inventory. The only exception is electricity that's imported into the state. And that is because AB 32 was explicit that we had to account for electricity consumed in state because we are a large market for electricity to be imported for our demand. I think that was it. Oh, the question about the other benchmarks and the SNAC one, those will be discussed in future workshops. So we will continue to have workshops over the coming months to bring in new topics and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. We have one hand left, and that is Townsend Colley. Townsend, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi guys, thanks for taking the question and thanks for continuing to host these workshops. I just had a quick question on slide 44, specifically where it discusses treating the POUs and the co-ops potentially differently because of, whether it be size or other factors. And I guess my question was, how exactly are you guys kind of picturing these, the POUs and the co-ops being treated differently? Because to me right here, the idea is that they're going to be consigning all their allowances. But, obviously, if you're going to be treating them differently, then, I guess is the idea that maybe like a smaller co-op wouldn't have to consign all their allowances? And if that's the case, do you feel at all that maybe that kind of goes against this idea of creating parity with the IOUs? Just since, if you're trying to create parity and then you go ahead and say, we're going to treat them differently because of, XYZ factor, that seems to not exactly line up to me. So I was just kind of curious what you guys were thinking with that statement. Thank you.
Thanks, Townsend, for those comments and questions. We'd really be interested in getting your perspective on how we should be thinking about potentially any different requirements for different types of utilities. I'll just note that we have just a handful of electricity co-ops in the state, and they're quite small. So there may be different abilities to execute on different types of things depending on the size of an entity. So that's one factor. And we're looking for ideas and suggestions as to how we should be thinking about and further evaluating these approaches. So welcome your input. Thank you.
Okay, and it looks like we do not have any more hands raised for public comment. So I will pass it back to Rachel and Camille. Thank you.
Thank you, Cypress. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending today and for all of your questions. We look forward to seeing your detailed and additional feedback. And we'll close here for now. Thank you and goodbye.